There's a moment, subtle, almost invisible, when an empathetic woman stops speaking from her heart. And if you're not paying attention, you'll miss it completely. Because what replaces her words isn't chaos. It isn't anger. It isn't even confrontation. It's silence. And not the kind of silence that seeks peace, but the kind that signals detachment. See, most people misunderstand silence. They think when someone stops arguing, things are getting better. They assume the absence of conflict means the presence of harmony. But with an empathetic woman, the opposite is often true. Her voice, her willingness to explain, to fight for connection, to express what she feels, that was the relationship. That was the bridge. And when she stops using it, it's not because everything is okay. It's because she no longer believes anything will change. An empath doesn't just communicate to be heard. She communicates because she cares. Every conversation, every emotional reaction, every attempt to resolve tension is an investment. It's her saying, this matters to me, you matter to me. So when that effort disappears, you're not witnessing calm, you're witnessing closure happening in real time. And here's where it becomes psychologically significant. Human beings are wired to respond to emotional feedback. Even negative attention, arguments, frustration, tension keeps a connection alive. It creates engagement. It signals that there's still something to lose. But silence removes all emotional feedback. It creates a vacuum. And the human mind doesn't handle vacuums well. That's when the shift happens. The person who once felt overwhelmed by her emotions now feels unsettled by her absence. The one who avoided deep conversations suddenly starts replaying every word she used to say. Because now there's nothing, no reminders, no pressure, no emotional presence, just space. And in that space, clarity hits harder than any argument ever could. Philosophically, this is the transition from attachment to detachment. When an empathetic woman is attached, she engages, she tries, she invests her energy into preserving meaning. But when she detaches, she withdraws that energy completely. Not as a strategy, not as manipulation, but as a natural consequence of emotional exhaustion. She's no longer trying to be understood. She's no longer trying to make you understand. She simply stops. And what makes this so powerful is that it's irreversible in most cases. Because once an empath reaches that point, she's already processed the loss internally, the conversations you never had. She had them in her own mind. The closure you're just beginning to seek, she's already found it within herself. So while you're reacting to her silence, she's already moved beyond the need to be heard. This is why her silence feels heavier than her words ever did, because words give you something to respond to. Silence gives you nothing except your own thoughts. And for many people, that's where the real discomfort begins. So when an empath woman goes quiet, don't mistake it for peace. Don't confuse it with patience. Understand it for what it is, a final withdrawal of emotional presence. Because once her silence replaces her love, you're no longer losing her attention, you're losing your place in her world. And once that silence settles in, something even more profound begins to unfold. Something most people never consciously recognized while it was there. The emotional supply is cut off. You see, an empathetic woman doesn't just exist in a relationship. She fuels it. She brings a level of emotional awareness, validation, and depth that most people don't even realize they're relying on. She reads between your words, senses, what you're not saying, and responds not just to your behavior, but to your inner state. That's a rare form of presence. And over time, it becomes something you depend on without ever acknowledging it. She's the one who reassures you when you doubt yourself. The one who softens your rough edges without making you feel judged. The one who listens, really listens, when the rest of the world is too distracted to care. And here's the key. She does it consistently. Not because she has to, but because it's in her nature to give, to nurture, to connect. But every system, no matter how resilient, has its limits. Psychologically, what she's providing is emotional regulation. She helps stabilize your internal world. When you're anxious, she grounds you. When you're uncertain, she brings clarity. When you're disconnected, she bridges the gap. That's not a small contribution. That's a foundational role. And when that role disappears, the absence is not subtle. It's destabilizing because now the emotional safety net is gone. There's no one translating your silence into understanding, no one absorbing your inconsistency and turning it into patience, no one filling in the emotional gaps you left unattended. And suddenly, the very things you once overlooked become impossible to ignore. This is where people start to feel something they can't quite name. It's not just missing her, it's missing how they felt around her. It's the loss of emotional certainty, the loss of being seen without having to explain yourself, the loss of a presence that made chaos feel manageable. And here's the deeper truth. Most people don't realize they were receiving this level of emotional support until it's gone. Because consistency is invisible when you're used to it. It fades into the background. It becomes normal, but remove it and everything shifts. Now, you're left to generate that same emotional stability on your own. And if you've never developed that capacity internally, the contrast is overwhelming. What once felt effortless now feels heavy. What once felt natural now feels forced. Philosophically, this is the difference between external and internal fulfillment. The empath was providing something externally that you hadn't fully built within yourself. And when she withdraws, you're confronted with that gap, not as punishment, but as reality. And understand this clearly. When an empath cuts off her emotional supply, she's not doing it to teach you a lesson. She's doing it because she has nothing left to give without losing herself. There's a boundary that gets crossed, not once, but repeatedly, and eventually her system recalibrates. It shuts down the output to preserve what remains. So now the warmth is gone. The validation is gone. The emotional cushion that once softened every fall is no longer there. And in its place is something far less comfortable, self-confrontation. Because without her presence to buffer your experience, you're left face to face with your own emotional patterns. Your avoidance, your inconsistency, your inability to meet her where she once stood waiting. And that's when it becomes clear. You didn't just lose a person, you lost a source of emotional depth, of understanding, of connection that was quietly sustaining something inside you. And once that source is gone, no amount of surface level interaction can replace it. Because what she gave wasn't ordinary, it was foundational. And when that foundation disappears, everything built on top of it begins to shake. And once that emotional supply is gone, something even more confronting begins to happen. She stops trying to fix you. Now, this is where many people experience a kind of delayed realization, because for a long time, they didn't even see what she was doing. It didn't look like fixing in the traditional sense. She wasn't controlling. She wasn't forcing change. She wasn't issuing ultimatums. What she was doing was far more subtle and far more powerful. She was holding a vision of who you could become. An empath woman has this unique ability to see beyond behavior. She sees patterns, wounds, contradictions. She recognizes the gap between who you are and who you have the potential to be. And instead of rejecting you for that gap, she leans in. She invests energy into understanding it, softening it, sometimes even carrying parts of it for you. She becomes patient where others would walk away. She becomes understanding where others would criticize. And in doing so, she often steps into a role that feels supportive on the surface, but underneath, it's deeply transformative. She's not just loving you for who you are. She's loving you for who you could be. But here's the reality. No one can sustain that role indefinitely without reciprocity, because growth requires participation. It requires self-awareness, accountability, effort. And when those things are missing, the dynamic becomes imbalanced. She's giving insight, offering emotional clarity, creating opportunities for change, and those opportunities are either ignored, resisted, or taken for granted. Over time, that creates a kind of internal fatigue. Psychologically, this is where the empath begins to shift from engagement to observation. She stops intervening. She stops translating your behavior into something meaningful. She stops trying to connect the dots for you, not because she no longer undid, stands, but because she realizes that understanding alone isn't enough to create change. And this is the turning point, because when she stops trying to fix you, she also stops buffering you from yourself. Before, she might have softened the impact of your actions. She might have explained your behavior in a way that made it easier for others or even for you to accept. She might have absorbed emotional consequences that you weren't ready to face. But now, all of that disappears. What remains is unfiltered reality. You're no longer interacting with someone who's actively trying to elevate you. You're facing the direct results of your own patterns without interpretation, without cushioning, without rescue. And for many people, that's uncomfortable because it requires a level of self-confrontation they've been able to avoid. Philosophically, this is the moment where responsibility shifts completely back to the individual. The empath steps out of the role of emotional guide, and what's left is a clear, unaltered mirror. Not one that distorts or judges, but one that reflects exactly what is. And here's what makes this so significant. When an empathing woman reaches this point, it's not impulsive. It's not emotional reactivity. It's a conscious withdrawal of effort after repeated cycles of unmet potential. She has already asked herself the hard questions. She has already given the benefit of the doubt. She has already extended patience beyond what most people would consider reasonable. So when she stops trying, it's not because she didn't care enough. It's because she cared enough to recognize that she can't do the work for you. And that's a difficult truth to accept because it removes any illusion that change was just waiting for the right moment. It reveals that change required action, and that action never came. So now there's no more guidance, no more emotion, scaffolding, no more quiet attempts to steer you towards something better, just space. And in that space, there's only one question left. What are you going to do with yourself? Now that no one is trying to do it for you, because when an empathetic woman stops trying to fix you, she's not giving up on your potential. She's handing it back to you. And once she stops trying to fix you, something shifts that many people never expected from her. The emergence of boundaries that are no longer flexible, no longer negotiable, and no longer influenced by emotion. This is where the real transformation happens. Because if you've known an empathetic woman in her earlier state, you've likely experienced her openness, her willingness to understand, to forgive, to give second, third, even fourth chances. Not because she lacks standards, but because she leads with empathy. She sees context where others see conclusions. She sees pain where others see behavior. And that perspective often makes her more tolerant than most. But tolerance, when repeatedly tested, evolves. Psychologically, what's happening here is a recalibration of self-worth. Every time a boundary is crossed and she chooses to stay, she's unconsciously negotiating her own value. She's asking herself, is this something I can hold space for, or is this something that diminishes me? And for a while, her capacity to hold space is vast. She absorbs, she processes, she rationalizes, until one day she doesn't. Not because she suddenly became cold, but because she became clear. Clarity is different from emotion. Emotion reacts. Clarity decides. And when an empath woman reaches clarity, her behavior changes in a way that can feel almost unrecognizable to those who only knew her softness. She stops explaining her boundaries. Before, she might have walked you through how your actions affected her. She might have given you insight, context, even solutions. She wanted you to understand because understanding felt like the pathway to change. But now she no longer feels the need to make you understand. She simply acts. Access is reduced. Availability disappears. The emotional door that was once always open is now closed. And not out of anger, but out of self-respect. And this is where people get confused. They interpret her firmness as harshness. They see her distance and assume she's being unforgiving. But what they're really witnessing is alignment. For the first time, her internal standards are matching her external behavior. Philosophically, this is the shift from external validation to internal authority. She's no longer making decisions based on how others feel, or how much potential she sees, or how much history exists. She's making decisions based on what is sustainable for her well-being. And that changes everything. Because now, the same behaviors she once tolerated are met with immediate disengagement. There's no negotiation, no emotional debate, no attempt to revisit the past. The line is clear, and once it's crossed, the consequence is consistent. That consistency is what makes her boundaries unbreakable. Not because they're rigid in a controlling way, but because they're rooted in self-awareness. She knows what it costs her to ignore them. She's experienced the emotional exhaustion, the internal conflict, the quiet erosion of her own needs. And she's no longer willing to pay that price. So when she says no, it's final. When she pulls back, it's intentional. When she walks away, it's not a reaction. It's a decision that's been forming long before you noticed it. And here's the deeper impact. People who were used to her flexibility often struggle the most with this version of her because they built their expectations around who she used to be. They expect access, pati, Ness's understanding without realizing that those things were never unconditional. They were earned through mutual respect and sustained through consistency. Once that consistency is broken, so is the access. And there's no returning to the previous dynamic because she's no longer the same person within it. This is the paradox of the empath. The very qualities that made her seem endlessly accommodating are the same qualities that, once awakened, make her absolutely unwavering. She hasn't lost her compassion. She's refined it. She's redirected it inward, where it was often neglected. And that's what makes her boundaries so powerful now. Not just because she enforces them, but because she understands why they exist. So when you encounter this version of her, you're not dealing with distance for the sake of distance. You're dealing with a woman who has finally decided that her peace is not negotiable. And once an empathful woman reaches that level of self-respect, there is nothing you can say, do, or promise that will make her betray it again. And once those boundaries are firmly in place, something even more profound becomes undeniable. You lose access to her depth. Now, this is not something most people recognize immediately, because depth isn't loud. It doesn't demand attention. It doesn't announce itself the way surface level attraction or excitement does. It reveals itself slowly over time in the way she listens, the way she understands, the way she connects dots that others don't even see. An empath woman doesn't just interact with you, she experiences you. She engages with your thoughts, your emotions, your contradictions, your silences. She meets you beneath the surface in a space where most people are either unwilling or unable to go. And when she invites you into that space, what you're receiving is rare. It's emotional intimacy without pretense. It's bed, Einstein, without performance. It's being understood without having to constantly explain yourself. But here's the reality. Depth requires openness on both sides. It requires presence, honesty, and a willingness to engage beyond the superficial. And when that exchange becomes one-sided, when she's the only one going deeper while the other person remains on the surface, something begins to fracture. At first, she compensates. She asks more questions. She tries different approaches. She creates opportunities for you to meet her at that level. Not because she's demanding, but because she believes in the possibility of connection. She sees what could exist if both people leaned in. But when those attempts are met with avoidance, inconsistency, or emotional unavailability, she starts to recognize a hard truth. Depth cannot be forced. Depth cannot be forced. Psychologically, this is where disillusionment sets in. Not with you as a person, but with the potential she once believed in. The version of you she connected with, the one she felt, the one she imagined building something meaningful with, begins to dissolve under the weight of reality. And when that happens, her depth doesn't disappear. It withdraws. She stops offering the parts of herself that required vulnerability. She stops initiating conversations that go beyond the surface. She stops sharing her inner world with someone who has shown they cannot hold it with the same level of care. And this is where the loss becomes irreversible. Because once an empath woman closes access to her depth, she doesn't reopen it easily. Not out of pride, not out of punishment, but out of recognition. She understands the value of what she was giving, and she understands the cost of giving it to the wrong person. Philosophically, this is a shift from unconscious generosity to conscious discernment. Before, she gave freely because it felt natural. Now, she gives selectively because it's necessary. She no longer equates openness with connection. She understands that true connection requires mutual capacity, and without that capacity, depth becomes a liability rather than a strength. So what does this look like from the outside? Conversations become lighter, shorter, less meaningful. The emotional richness that once defined your interactions is replaced with neutrality. She's still polite, still composed, but the substance is gone. The feeling that you are part of something deeper, something rare, it's no longer there. And what makes this so difficult to process is that you can sense the difference, even if you can't fully articulate it. You know something valuable has been lost. You feel the absence of something that once made the connection feel significant. But by the time you feel it, she's already accepted it. Because for her, the loss didn't happen in a single moment. It happened gradually through every missed opportunity for real connection, every avoided conversation, every instance where depth was met with distance. So when she finally pulls back, it's not a reaction, it's a conclusion. You didn't just lose her presence, you lost access to a level of connection that most people spend their entire lives searching for and rarely find. And once that door closes, it doesn't reopen for familiarity, history, or regret. Because depth, once unappreciated, does not return. It relocates. And when all of this is unfolded, when the silence has settled, the emotional supply has been withdrawn, the effort to fix has ended. The boundaries have solidified and the depth has been reclaimed. What remains is perhaps the most difficult reality to accept. She becomes a stranger you can't reach, not because she's trying to be distant, not because she's playing a role or proving a point, but because something fundamental has shifted within her. The emotional connection that once made access to her feel natural, even effortless, is no longer there. And what replaces it is not anger, it's indifference. Now, this is where most people get it wrong. They assume that if she's no longer expressing frustration, no longer reacting, no longer engaging emotionally, then maybe things have neutralized. Maybe there's still a chance to rebuild. But indifference is not neutrality. It's the absence of emotional investment altogether. Psychologically, indifference is the end state of repeated emotional depletion. It's what happens when someone has felt everything they could possibly feel. Disappointment, hope, frustration, empathy, and eventually reaches a point where there's nothing left to process. The emotional system doesn't shut down out of weakness. It shuts down because it has completed the cycle. There's nothing unresolved on her end anymore. And that's what makes her feel like a stranger. Because the version of her you knew was emotionally engaged. She reacted, she responded, she cared. Even her frustration had meaning because it was rooted in a desire to connect, to improve, to hold on to something that mattered. But now that layer is gone. You're no longer interacting with someone who is emotionally tied to the outcome. You're interacting with someone who has already let go. And this creates a kind of psychological dissonance because externally she may still be the same person, calm, composed, even respectful, but internally the connection has been severed. The emotional familiarity that once made you feel understood, even in silence, has been replaced by distance that you can't quite close. You might try to reach her the way you used to. You might bring up the past, attempt to reconnect, even try to evoke a reaction, anything that resembles the emotional engagement that once exists. But what you'll find is that those attempts no longer land the same way because she's no longer there in the way she once was. Philosophically, this is the final stage of detachment. It's not about creating distance. It's about becoming unaffected. She's no longer anchored to shared history, unmet expectations, or imagined futures. She has stepped out of the emotional framework that once defined the connection. And once someone reaches that point, there is no pathway back through persuasion, apology, or effort alone. Because reconnection requires emotional openness, and she has already closed that door, not impulsively, not out of pride, but out of resolution. She has made peace with what was, accepted what is, and released what could have been. And in doing so, she has reclaimed her emotional autonomy. That's why she feels like a stranger, not because she changed into someone else, but because she returned to herself without the attachment that once included you. And here's the part that's hardest to accept. You can't compete with indifference. You can negotiate with anger. You can respond to sadness. You can even work through frustration. But indifference offers no entry point. It gives you nothing to engage with, nothing to influence, nothing to rebuild from. It simply exists as a quiet, immovable reality. So when you find yourself standing in front of this version of her, trying to understand how someone who once cared so deeply can now feel so distant, recognize what you're actually witnessing, you're not seeing the loss of emotion. You're seeing the completion of it. And once an empath woman reaches that state, she doesn't look back, not because she's cold, but because there's nothing left pulling her there. She has already let go. And when someone lets go at that level, they don't just walk away from you, they walk beyond your reach. When you step back and look at the entire journey, what you begin to understand is that nothing about this transformation is sudden. It doesn't happen overnight. It's not impulsive, and it's not driven by ego. It's a process, a quiet internal shift that unfolds over time. An empath woman doesn't wake up one day and decide to stop caring. She arrives there. She arrives there after trying to communicate when she wasn't heard, after giving when it wasn't reciprocated, after seeing potential that was never realized, after extending patience beyond what most people would consider reasonable. Every moment you thought she was still there, she was slowly detaching. Every time you assumed things were fine, she was recalibrating her emotional investment. By the time you noticed a change, she's already gone through the hardest part. And that's the part most people never see. They see the silence, but not the conversations she had with herself. They feel the distance, but not the emotional weight she carried before creating it. They experience the indifference, but not the depth of care that came before it. So what looks like a sudden shift is actually a final decision, one built on repeated patterns, unmet needs, and the realization that love, no matter how deep, cannot survive without mutual effort. And this is where the lesson becomes universal, because this isn't just about losing an empath woman. It's about understanding the cost of taking emotional presence for granted. It's about recognizing that the people who love deeply also leave quietly when that love is no longer valued. It's about realizing that connection is not maintained by intention alone, but by consistent action. You don't lose someone like this in the moment they walk away. You lose them in the moments you failed to meet them where they stood, when they were still open, still giving, still willing. And once they close that door, it's not locked out of anger. It's closed out of clarity. So if there's one thing to take from all of this, it's this. When someone shows up for you with depth, with patience, with emotional presence, recognize it while it's there. Respond to it, match it. Because once it's gone, it doesn't come back in the same form. And when an empathized woman stops caring, it's not a phase, it's not a tactic, and it's not a test. It's the end of access to a version of her that you will never experience again.